My name is Alfred Bilili from Malawi. Can you just shed more light on this Canada Convention? What will it be all about? The Canada Convention.
Thank you for the convention. A question about our convention in Canada. The Canadian Special Crop Association is the national industry association, processors and exporters of peas, lentils, beans, chickpeas, mustard, canary seed, buckwheat, sunflower. So this is a convention that is now attracting more international visitors, but primarily we're looking at Canadian production of these crops, export. Some of the themes that we'll be looking at our convention this year are some of the emerging producing areas of the world. I think we'll probably look at Russia and Eastern and Europe. So it's basically a two-day convention where we bring together many of the Canadian exporters, Canadian farmers, and increasingly we're having international visitors come to that convention. So I'd be glad to give you more information and some website, and we can go into more detail then. Thanks.
Hello. Hello.
Are we having any more questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello. Hello.
Check,
Yeah.
check. Yep.
Hello. My name is Gopal Krishna from India.
Please
This is
go
regarding-
ahead.
This is regarding red lentils.
See, she has to bend down.
I think what I heard in Canada, the variety crimson is not been grown last 6 to 7 years, but this has been traded every year, even recently also. How is it possible? Is there a equivalent quality or a variety which is being traded? I just want the clarification from Mr. Gordon.
Well, I'm wondering if some of the Canadian exporters in the room might want to answer that question related to, the variety of lentil and the quality comparison between crimson and some of the newer varieties. So maybe while one of the Canadian trade would like to address that question, one thing I would point out is that the Crop Development Center at the University of Saskatchewan has the most aggressive plant breeding program and lentil development program of any facility in the world, so that we're constantly improving the varieties, improving the yield, improving disease resistance, and ultimately this is improving the quality. So I don't have information where I can compare crimson to some of the newer varieties, but one of the criteria for releasing new varieties is that you're making constant improvement in yield and quality. So likely there's going to be some small differences between varieties, but I would leave it to some of the exporters and processors to make some additional comment about specific quality differences that might exist between crimson and some of the varieties that are more commonly grown now. I'm just looking in the audience to see if I see some of the Canadian processors, but again, maybe what I can do is, why don't you approach me after the session and I'll get your business card and I'll ask the university to get in touch with you and give you some specific details about the quality of crimson versus some of the varieties being grown now. And we also, actually, we have some people from Sask Agriculture and Food. So maybe Dale, why don't you take a stab at this question? If there's a microphone, we can have it over here.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. I'll take a stab at that question. I think if I understand it correctly, you were wondering why crimson is less available in the marketplace and why it's being replaced by other varieties. And as Gordon mentioned, the Crop Development Center, which is the primary breeders that do most of our breeding work and development of new red lentils of varieties, are constantly looking at improving varieties. And for the most part, what they look at is try to increase the yield potential for the red lentils as well as disease resistance. And some of the new varieties are also known as herbicide-tolerant types of varieties, which are really well appreciated and well utilized by farmers in Canada that are more conducive to weed control with better methods of controlling weeds. And in addition to that, Crimson has been noted as a variety that has been subject to diseases like Ascochyta, which is probably our most common plant disease that affects lentils. And people have moved away from that in order to rely less on fungicides to control that particular disease and give you a better quality lentil, better quality red lentil than what Crimson might have done in the past. So that, I think, may answer your question, I hope. If not, feel free to approach me later on and I can talk to you a little bit more about that.
My name is Sanjay Shah. I'm from Bombay. I would like to know about the Canadian government subsidy policy vis-a-vis oilseeds, grains, and pulses. In the last 3 years, has there been any shift in the government policy into subsidies of these particular products?
Thanks for the question. No, Canadian government is not subsidizing production of any crop. The government of Canada moved away from crop-specific support programs, with the exception of crop insurance, where farmers can pay a premium, with the premium being shared between federal government, provincial government, and farmers. But that's basically to cover yield insurance. And there are aggregate income support programs available to Canadian farmers. But specifically, the Government of Canada has tried to move away to be production neutral and not encourage production of any one crop. So there is no subsidy or incentive on inputs or any element of producing canola versus peas versus wheat. I think it's an important change that we made a number of years ago in Canada to move away from crop-specific support. And there has been no change in these programs over the last 4 to 5 years. While they're getting ready for the next presentation, Loda, the one thing I was going, oh, there's a question here, so.
Sorry to come back. My name is Alfred again from Malawi. Just by extension to the last question, perhaps you would know any other country that is subsidizing production of pulses?
Well, one of the countries that does come to mind is France, where I think it'd be better to have perhaps Mies can talk about this in his presentation. So maybe we'll leave some of the comment about French government support for pea production to Mies's presentation. I'm going to ask a question then. Mies van Dongen, I have a question for you. You ended your presentation talking about the increase in demand for flour and fractions from peas, in part because of the interest in gluten-free. And as we all know, countries around the world are facing issues with diabetes and cardiovascular disease. I'm interested in your view on how food companies in Europe might continue their interest in looking at pulses for more processed foods. Do you have any sense? I mean, you're seeing new plant construction for fractionation. Any sense on how big that market could get?
I think that market can go, what we said before, we were 150,000 tons only 4 or 5 years ago for starch. It's okay? For starch. So we are now today, we're 450,000 tons of usage, which is mostly in Germany, Belgium, and France. Because France is for the consumer a big, huge market for yogurts. Not only yogurts, but you have the flour, you have the starch which you put into the yogurt, you have the flour which you make biscuits. And I don't know how many of you were in Barcelona last year on the Sicils. One of the producers there had a very good presentation. It was called Rocket. I don't know if Gordon remembers, and she had a very good presentation. I think she could do it better than I do talk about it, but that's an increasing market. This company in France, we started with 25,000 tons 4 years ago. They're now at nearly 100,000 tons per year. So that's an increasing market and an increasing demand for very, very special products.
And Mies, maybe I would just add to that. We had the opportunity to visit a few food companies here in the Mumbai area, and this interest in improving health with addition of pulse flours to crackers, biscuits, and other food products is also of interest here in India. So I think on a global basis, this is something that we're already seeing in China. We're seeing in Europe, and increasingly, I think, as we learn more in the pulse industry, we have this opportunity to be increasing demand in this processed food market. So I think it's really one to watch, and we often tend to look at demand by country, and I think that we need to think a little bit about demand by end use, and instead of maybe look at demand by country, we should be looking at demand for flour, demand for starch, demand for protein, because some of those numbers that were small a few years ago are now becoming very significant.
Is there any other question from the audience, please? Yeah,
Good
please.
morning. Thank you. I'm Jean Shirinda from Mozambique Embassy in Delhi. My question is from the company from US. I want to know if your company have any strategy or any kind of plan to the African market.
I wouldn't say that, I certainly wouldn't say that we'd ever not consider it. We're always looking, the United States is primarily an exporter of pulses, and we're always looking for new markets. We've kind of been on an increase in production in pulses over the last 5 years with the exception of our weather issues, but we think it's a viable market, and there has been some product moving in that direction slowly.
Good afternoon. Naresh Shah from Virani Foods, UK. We are millers of chickpeas and yellow peas. My question is to the Australian gentleman. Recently, we've had issues with desi chickpea or chana dal mainly. The issue is there's a lot of contamination from gluten. We're supposed to be gluten-free supplies coming out of Australia. We've now seen several cargoes which have higher than normal contamination for gluten. So is there any way where you can assure us that the supply chain from Australia is secure? We've been told by shippers that because chickpeas are grown in rotation and there is always possibility of that wheat or barley is being in the system. Can you give us some assurance? Because we are facing regulatory pressure where we say it's gluten-free. It has to be below a detectable level. Thank you.
That's a very tough question. I guess it depends where that contamination of gluten is coming from. If you're suggesting it's coming from cereal, from contact with cereals, then I guess anything coming out of our central handling system will always have that potential to have that contamination. I'm quite certain I know of 2 or 3 packing facilities, if we're talking containers, in Australia where they can, properly segregate. But yeah, to be honest, I'd like to know a lot more detail about where the contamination is really coming from before you could really answer that question in detail. To be honest, it's the first I've heard of it.
If I could just make what I understand from European regulation perspective is that to be considered gluten-free, it has to be below 20 parts per million. And this is getting at this issue of tolerance levels for whether they're contaminants or residues of one kind or another. I think we're having a panel discussion to talk specifically about some of the issues related to India, but it is an important question, I guess, in terms of how, as an industry, we can meet some standards. But I'd be interested in talking to you a little bit more just to understand your understanding of below level of detection versus some of these regulations that we've looked at in the food industry, specifically about looking at the gluten-free market. My understanding was that it was a new regulation in Europe, which was 20 parts per million, which was in fact what US and Canada were looking at as well, is one of the reasons why I was somewhat familiar with that issue of gluten tolerance.
Yeah, hi. Question to the person from Australia. In your presentation, you'd mentioned about 0.15 million desi stock in Australia. So how much of that is good in quality and which can be exportable to the countries like India and Bangladesh?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think predominantly all of the remaining stocks now are of a good quality. Yeah, there's a small amount of defective peas left, but Pakistan and the UAE is very quickly taking those. So I believe nearly all of what is left now is of a good quality and suitable for Bangladesh and suitable for India.
Don Crane from Commodity Specialists. This is for maize. Jeff or Gord, maybe Gord, you talked about this bit, but Jeff, you touched on it a bit with the pet food industry. Where do you think it is going in the next 5 years? We see an increase in the amount of demand for lentils, peas, and chickpeas. Just wanted to see if any of you guys want to give your opinion on that.
Don, yes, definitely in the United States we'll see a continued increase in demand for peas and lentils into the pet food industry. One of the things we've seen, there was a time when they were buying lower quality product, and now they're actually demanding higher quality product to get into pet food rations. And they're paying, in some cases, higher prices than what the rest of the world is paying, what the people are paying for pulses.
Thank you, Chair. I stand to be guided. I know one of the speakers has touched on the regulatory issues. So I'm not sure whether this is the right session because I have an issue on methyl bromide. Methyl bromide.
I think there's a session this afternoon where we'll be talking about some phytosanitary and plant quarantine issues. So if I'm not mistaken, that I think is going to be covered off in a panel discussion this afternoon.
That's fine, thank you.
We have with us a very interesting and a very knowledgeable panel here. Let me begin from the left. We have Varinder from Emsons. Emsons is a large pea importer and stock and sale. Of course, their principal business being rice. It's promoted by the Monga family. And Varinder, thanks once again for quickly responding and joining the panel. Next to him is Brett Dotson. Brett is from Australia. He is going to give us his inputs of the Australian crop. And he has been in the industry for a number of years. I know him for a long time, and he is certainly one of Australia's experts. Chad Popovich from Viterra. Viterra, friends, is the largest grain and pulses company in Canada, and today is the largest supplier of peas in India. We are fortunate that Chad is with us. He is instrumental in this business, which has taken off in the last 2 years. And I think over 50% of the Indian market supplies are done by Chad and his company, Viterra. Next to him is Mr. Hakan Bahachechi. Mr. Bahachechi, as you have already heard him speak at our inaugural day, is a veteran in the pulses business. Over the last 10 years, he has exponentially grown his presence across several countries, and among the latest has been the Russian and Ukrainian areas from where he has been actively participating in the pea markets and in the destination markets in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Mr. Mees is also a veteran of this business. Mr. Mees has spent several decades in one of France's largest trading and processing company called Soufflet. He has been in this business for close to 30 years, am I right, Mees? 40 years, I'm sorry. So we have some, we have over probably 200 years of experience among all the panelists here. And what we are going to attempt to do today, friends, is try to get an input from each panelist of their country, of their product, or some ideas of a supply situation there, some ideas of supply and demand situations, their experiences as far as the demand side is concerned, and then I will try to create a debate as to a question-answer session amongst the panelists. And finally, I would like the audience also to participate, with the idea being is to create a price outlook or to create a price range that we could come to and forecast what peas from Canada and Russia and France will do over the next, at least for the next 6 months, if not for 12 months. We have seen a year of very high volatility. We have seen weather issues in several countries. We have seen huge fluctuations in currency. We were faced by the European crisis, and all these have affected in many ways pricing of pulses at origin as well as destination. We have seen almost a 16 to 17% drop in the Indian rupee. We have seen the appreciation of the Canadian dollar, of the Australian dollar. So we have a lot to discuss here, and let me start with Mees, what his comments will be on the peas in France, which he's already spoken, but at least on what he feels in terms of supply, demand, and then we will go on to the next panelist. Mees.
Coming back to France, you have seen in my presentation that we had about 685,000 tons, let's say 700,000 tons, of which we can export, I would say, 70% of it if we have to. We don't have to. It's depending on what? It's depending on currency. I think nowadays the currency is the most important thing. Last year we had a US dollar rupee, you know all, from 44 to 55, which is 20%. So what is making the market? Is it the price of the peas? Is it the supply and demand? I think that currency is very, very important factor of the price setting for next year also. We see the US dollar euro, which is from 125 to 135. That's another 8%. 8% on a price of $400, let's say, for yellow peas. You're talking about $30. Then we have seen the future market, because everything in France nowadays is traded over the future market for wheat. Since 2 years, every kilo is, even the farmer, traded over the future market for wheat. So the price is more or less today. We have seen for the Matif, we have seen the price from 225 to 150, which is 30%. A 30% increase last year, or a switch, 30%. On top of that, you see your currency. On top of that, you see your rupee. So what's driving the price? It's very difficult to predict. If we say today, if you say today, what would be the price for next year? The starch people are paying already in France $100 over the wheat price. Wheat price is 260, so they pay $100 over. You talk about 360. You add on your freight, you talk about 425. C&F India. So I guess that would be then also more or less a minimum price for the French piece. And
Could you repeat the FOB and the CNF equivalent, Mies? Could you repeat the price you just mentioned on the FOB basis, as well as the freight?
The freight, yeah, you talk about 260 FOB for the wheat, put on 360, put on a 65 freight, talk about 425. C&F India as a minimum price, because that today is paid by the starch people, and they can use a lot. They can use a lot. If it's 650,000 tons of crop, we have to ship also to Norway for fish food, and so it depends really on the dollar. What happened last year? How could we export to India a couple of cargoes? Because what? Because of the lower Matif, the low wheat price, and the very, very high dollar rate against the euro at the time of the crisis, when the crisis started with Greece. That was the only reason that we could export. We couldn't export. If we see a dollar which is 135, stay like this, if we see the high wheat price, I don't think we would be able to export, or France need any export of cargoes, bulk cargoes to India.
Hakan, can we have your inputs, please?
Yeah, I fully agree with Ms. I think we are in an area where the macro factors affect the pricing completely. When we started in Russia this year, the currency was around 28.5 rubles to a dollar. And for those who were in Barcelona would remember in the panel discussion, the overall pea pricing was expected to be very bullish. And I think Russian currency from 28.5 went all the way to gradually, not, I'm talking in a couple of weeks, past 30, then 31, then 32. So this obviously was in favor of the lower prices. I mean, that's why Russia remained this year as a continuous supplier, and at a price much lower than the other origins. Mies has done a very good presentation earlier. He has given the numbers, so I don't want to go over that. But the general tendency from farmers' point of view is to diversify more from grain into special crops. The main reason is they are getting affected by the decisions of the policymakers. We have seen the wheat is a strategic product, so any decision on export ban or export quota is affecting the farmers directly. Whereas pea or chickpea, these are special crops that are not regularized by the policymakers. So we see a tendency towards farming more of the pulses. And these last 2 years, the markets have supported, the demand supported the production. And if you look at the Russian chickpea figure, I would tend to disagree with the number provided by Stats on the chickpea, which showed about 43,000 tons. I think the chickpea production in Russia was over 100,000 tons this year. And
and the peas production?
Pea production, I agree, it was around 1.5, 1.6 in my opinion. And I also agree with me comment that we might see this year a little over 2 million tons. But right now in Russia, I mean, everything is frozen, including the vessels with the cargo on it is frozen in the sea. You can go for skating on Azov Sea, or for that matter, it's the same situation in Ukraine. All the ports are frozen. And it's difficult to make an assessment to your next question as to where the prices are going to be and the new crop, because this condition has not been seen for a very long time, and it seems it's not going to go away quickly. So we hope that the ice will defrost first, and then, you know, the vessels that are stuck, which is more than 30, 35 vessels, can go out.
Right.
And so we can talk more on the new crop pricing. I'll feel more comfortable to put some values when we see some progress on weather conditions in Russia, and that probably for those who will be in Dubai will get the closest estimate.
Correct. Thank you, Hakan. Some very important comments by Hakan. Hakan highlighted the fact that in today's day and time, it is not the supply demand alone which drives prices. It is not the supply demand which makes the markets bullish or bearish, but it is macro issues which we need to watch, and most importantly, the movement of currency that needs to be monitored very closely outside of just the traditional way that we would do our supply-demand analysis. Very impressive shipments out of Russia. I think the Indian trading community was pleasantly surprised at the quantity that came out of Russia this year, and seeing the numbers of last year of 1.5 to 1.75 million tons, and as Hakan predicts that if the snow melts in time, this production go up to 2 million tons. So that is a big jump, and we can fast see another Canada being created in Russia itself as an important origin. With this, I'll take you over to Chad. Chad, your comments on the fact that, of course, what you think on the production jump in Russia, and your comments on the Canadian supply-demand situation.
Thank you. I guess from a Canadian standpoint, a lot has been mentioned already in the previous presentations, but as everyone knows, the stocks are very tight in the current situation. I guess with that, the prices on the origin side of things remain very, very firm. Producers just are not willing to sell at today's prices. There's been basically a little bit of a dry spell here over the past few months, a healthy spread between where producers are willing to sell and where the demand actually sits. So there's been a lack of activity over the past few months. As we all know, the exports out of Canada year to date are very, very strong. So that really doesn't put any pressure on the producer side to sell today. That's why they're holding back. Just to mention cash flow as well. Cash flow is very, very strong, not only on the pulse side of things, but from canola and other commodities in Canada. So with the farmer being cash rich, again, it does not relate into any panic selling from his side. And I guess finally, just from a supply standpoint, looking into new crop, with 2.1 million metric ton production this past year, I believe acreage is definitely going to increase. It will increase on the back of support and basically margin to the farmer. Ultimately, we need to be paying a competitive price in order to retain that acreage. I think we need acreage of about 3 million tons in Canada to supply the demand. Something interesting which has been mentioned earlier is the change to the Canadian Wheat Board legislation in Canada that will change the dynamic of, I guess, what gets planted and ultimately the competitiveness of the certain crops in Canada. In saying that, we need to be competitive with price. You know, right now, current prices, I guess CFR on a FOB standpoint in Canada are around 380, FOB Stowe Trim, West Coast, Vancouver. That relates into about a price of about 425 CFR India, and that's an old crop price today. For new crop, there's been, I guess, very little action on the new crop side of things because it is still a little bit early. However, if we can get to a price of 400 plus, I would say, on a CFR basis, we will definitely get to that 2.7 to 3 million acreage standpoint in Canada, which again, like I mentioned, we will need, and that should support the pulse acreage on the Canadian standpoint. Just a little bit on the demand. obviously been in India, and we've been focused on the Indian demand, which has been a little bit slow over the past few months. It was mentioned earlier, but China's becoming a very large player from Canadian pea standpoint. To date, they've taken roughly about 450,000 tons of yellow and green peas from Canada, and they're expected to hit around the 600,000 ton mark for this crop year. To date, India has taken about 630,000 tons of green and yellow peas year to date. And S&D, based on my numbers, we are expecting India still to take about 900,000 to 1 million tons. Some of that is going to be compensated, obviously, by the 250 to 300,000 tons that was shipped from European origins early in the year. But we still think that there's a ways to go, and again, stocks are very tight in Canada.
Thanks, Chad. That was very insightful. Friends, Chad is talking in terms of shipment of the Canadian crop year. Am I right? That is August to July?
Sorry?
Those numbers were of the Canadian crop year.
That is correct, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and the numbers that I gave is year to date. So it is basically takes us up to the end of February with what we know today in the vessel lineup or business that's already on the books.
So that's a very impressive shipping program, a very aggressive than what we saw in the presentations earlier today. Another point that has been repeated by Chad is that the farmers are cash rich. Agricultural commodities have given good returns to farmers. Farmers are sitting on cash. Chandrasekhar also had the same opinion that farmers are sitting on cash and now have the choice of whether they would like to deliver or not. Another clear comment that Chad made was, of course, the increase in acreage, but we'll take that on the second round of discussions. His prices are very clear. It's for the old crop, it's 380 FOB, converting to 425 CNF, and probably cheaper at the way the freight rate or the freight market is today. The freight market is down in the dumps and could go down further. And new crop, Chad is putting around $400. Am I right? Around that price. The other element which is affecting these markets and which is fairly new is that China has come into the market as a buyer. And I think later on towards the panel discussion, we shall discuss whether we see China as another India in terms of pea imports. I will let Brett step in now and give us his views on the dun pea situation in Australia, and we had a huge weather problem last year. What is left now, what the supply demand is, and what he sees here on. So dun peas, friends, as you know, is mainly imported into Tuticorin and Calcutta. So I would like some interaction from our participants and members from these two areas too. Thank you. Brett, please.
Thanks, Pravin. Just quickly, I know Rob touched on peas earlier. Virtually Australia has production actually dropped this last season. We went from about 460,000 tonnes last year with massive exports from Australia, greater than I've seen for many a year. India took about 187,000 tonnes. As Rob said, we're more of a price follower, obviously with a small fish compared to Canada. This year, Pulse Australia and both ABARE are saying around 303,000 tonnes. So it's about on these figures, about 160,000 tonnes down. That's come from a couple of things. One, high prices on other commodities, canola, wheat, etc. when the sowing time came about. Secondly, we also had some adverse weather conditions around that September, October when the plant was maturing. The other factor was Western Australia had a frost while the plant was maturing, which probably cut its production by half. So if you break it down, so understand the Australian market a little better, we have a fairly strong domestic market in Victoria and New South Wales, and essentially all those peas grown in that area get sucked up by two major splitters in a company called Ward Mackenzie and Unigrain. Then the New South Wales product gets sucked up into the stock feed market. So essentially you have left South Australia, which is very consistent in its production normally, but it's probably down about 80 to 100,000 tonnes on last year. Western Australia went from probably 50-odd thousand tonnes, having a couple of vessels available, to one available this year. So, you know, from that point of view, you know, the production is down. Saying that, one thing I will make is that in Australia we've had a change of shipping structure over the last 2 to 3 years, which is now causing major concern for the pulse industry in general. The bigger players in wheat and barley and canola, etc., pre-book shipping slots, and you can't get a shipping slot now in Australia or out of South Australia in particular, probably out until August. Okay, so unless a company has pre-booked a shipping slot, then they have the capacity to ship. So from a farmer point of view, the prices of obviously were earlier in the year high, have come back down to historical low levels again. We're below $300 track, and like Chad mentioned about the Canadian farmers, they're very reluctant sellers below this value. So I think from a standpoint now, we're probably looking to probably be at a low base, heading towards a higher base. The other factor I would sort of keep in mind is obviously China prices are going up, as Rob pointed out from an Australian point of view. That spread between, you know, China and dun peas and yellow peas is now blown out probably to, you know, over $200 a tonne, which is historically very high. So we're going to see more substitutions, especially into Chitty Corinne and those markets, where the container market will start to take over. So from a price point of view today, replacement with no margin and looking at a spot shipment, not carrying it forward, you'd be talking probably around that 370, 375 FOB. You add on your freights, you're probably, as Rob said, around that 420, 425 to 430 range, depending on where you're shipping. Going forward, from a crop estimate next year, too early to predict. We don't do our sowing until May, June. And we're obviously going to be fairly heavily linked to what happens between now and then. I would suggest that you know, canola prices are very high again, so we may see some acreage taken away. But as I said, you know, South Australia is normally very consistent, so I would suggest that we'll stay probably around that 150 to 200,000 tonnes of production in that area. So.
Any prices for new crop?
No, there's nothing posted out there at this point in time.
Well, it seems like you and Chad have been sharing your notes and come prepared, because your price is identical on the old crop. It's $425. That was Brett for you. Another point, a very important point that Brett made and we need to be very conscious about, is that the spread between the yellow peas and chana is at its historical high. It is at 15,000 rupees, which converts to $300 a ton. So it's historically high, and I think at some stage this spread needs to break either way. So that was a very interesting point brought about by Brett. And I'll now ask Varinder to tell us about what is going to happen with 500,000 tons or more of yellow peas, dun peas, and peas of all kinds, which are lying in every port of India, in the hinterland. And over and above that, we are going straight into a new crop, which I understand is a record crop in UP. So there is going to be probably 1 million tons of peas available in the next 60 days. So Varinder, can you shed some light on how the demand has been?
Well, I have not come prepared. I thought I'm here to fill the chair only.
No, but you don't need to prepare.
Well, first of all, I would like to agree with Mr. Hakan, what he said, that Russian output has really surprised us all this year, and this has had impact